Hey, this video is for education and entertainment, and it's built on a genuinely alarming stack of research. Alright, let's dig. Deep in the mountains of northern Spain, at the bottom of a cave system, there is a pit. To reach it, you have to crawl and climb through a labyrinth of narrow passages, and then descend a vertical shaft about 13 meters straight down, the length of a 4-story building dropping into blackness. At the bottom of that shaft is a chamber, and in that chamber archaeologists found one of the greatest treasures in the entire study of human origins. The Spanish name for the place tells you exactly what they found. It's called Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. And among those bones is a skull with a story written into it in the most chilling way imaginable. Because when researchers examined it, they found, high on the forehead, 2 holes. 2 wounds. And the way those 2 wounds were made turns this ancient skull into what may be the oldest murder ever discovered, a killing that happened around 430,000 years ago. But before we solve the murder, let us talk about the crime scene, because the pit of bones is a mystery all by itself. Sima de los Huesos has produced the remains of at least 28 individuals. Not one, not a handful. 28 ancient humans, all piled together at the bottom of a shaft, deep inside a cave, in a chamber that has no natural light and would have been almost impossible to live in. These weren't Homo sapiens, by the way. They lived long before us. They belonged to an earlier human population, closely related to the ancestors of Neanderthals. Some researchers class them within Homo heidelbergensis, others place them right on the road to the Neanderthal line. Either way, these were another kind of human, walking the earth hundreds of thousands of years before you. And how do we even know the age? That oddly specific 430,000 years. It comes from dating methods applied to the cave itself, including uranium-series dating of the mineral deposits that formed in the chamber, cross-checked against other techniques and against the style of the few stone tools and the animal bones found nearby. No single method is perfect that far back. But when several independent clocks all point to roughly the same window, confidence grows. That's a theme worth remembering across everything on this channel. A date in deep time is almost never one measurement. It's a consensus of several, each with its own weaknesses triangulating together on an answer. So here's the first mystery. How did 28 of them end up at the bottom of a pit? Animals didn't drag them there. The mix of bones doesn't match what scavengers leave behind, and there are very few carnivore remains mixed in. They didn't live down there. You can't live in a lightless hole at the base of a vertical shaft. They didn't all fall in by accident. That's 28 separate unlucky tumbles into the exact same hidden chamber, which strains belief. The explanation that many researchers have landed on is genuinely startling. It looks like these bodies were deliberately placed there, that the living carried or dropped their dead down that shaft into that chamber on purpose. And if that's true, it's one of the earliest hints anywhere in the record of what we might call funerary behaviour. The treatment of the dead as something more than discarded meat. Nearly 500,000 years ago, a kind of human that wasn't us may have been gathering its dead and committing them to a special place in the earth. That alone would make the pit of bones extraordinary. But then there's the skull. Before we get to the skull, it's worth appreciating what it took to even find this stuff, because the pit of bones sits inside a larger complex called Atapuerca, one of the most important fossil sites on the entire planet. Excavating the Sima is brutal, painstaking work. Teams have spent decades crawling down into that shaft, sifting the cave floor grain by grain, hauling up fragments in the dark. The bones don't come out whole and labelled. They come out as thousands of shattered pieces mixed together that researchers then reassemble like the world's most difficult and most morbid jigsaw puzzle. Cranium-17 itself was rebuilt from dozens of separate fragments recovered over multiple seasons. The 2 holes only became a murder case after someone had painstakingly glued a shattered forehead back together and noticed that the damage lined up into a pattern. Discovery in this field is not a single dramatic moment. It's years of patient, unglamorous labour, and it's the reason we can talk about a killing from nearly 500,000 years ago at all. The skull is catalogued with the unromantic name Cranium-17, and when the team, led by researchers including Nohemi Salah, examined it, they focused on those two holes above the left eye. Now, a hole in an ancient skull is not automatically evidence of violence. Bones get damaged after death all the time. Rocks fall, sediment shifts, the weight of ages cracks and punctures fossils constantly. So the crucial question was, were these wounds made before death or after? A living skull and a dead skull break differently. Here's how they cracked it, and it's real forensic detective work applied to a victim who died 430,000 years ago. First, both holes were essentially identical in shape and size. A random rockfall doesn't tend to punch two matching holes in the same spot. Two nearly identical wounds suggest the same object striking twice. Second, they analysed the trajectory of each impact, the angle the force came from. Both blows came from a similar direction, consistent with someone facing the victim and striking downward. And third, most tellingly, they looked at the fracture lines radiating out from the holes. When bone is struck while it's still living, still slightly flexible, still full of moisture, it fractures in a characteristic way that's different from how dry, long-dead bone shatters. The fracture pattern around these wounds was the living kind. Put it all together, and the team reached a conclusion that reaches across nearly 500,000 years. This individual was struck twice in the head, face to face with the same object, by another individual, and it killed them. This was not an accident. This was not a fall. Two blows, same weapon, same angle, delivered by someone standing in front of them. In the careful language of the researchers, this is the earliest case of lethal interpersonal violence in the human fossil record. In plain language, it's the oldest known murder. Sit with that for a moment. 430,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens even existed, before Neanderthals as we know them in a world we can barely picture, one person looked another person in the face and struck them down. We will never know why. Was it a fight over food, over a mate, over status, over some insult lost to time? Was it rage, or was it cold and deliberate? The skull can tell us the how. Twice, face to face, same object, but the motive died with the two people involved, and no forensic technique will ever recover it. All we have is the fact of it, that the oldest story our bones can tell about one person and another is, heartbreakingly, a story of harm. And then, in a detail that somehow makes it even more human, that victim's body was carried through the cave and lowered down the shaft into the pit of bones alongside the others. The same people capable of killing were, it seems, also capable of caring for their dead. Both of those things together in the same species at the same time. If that isn't a mirror held up to us, I don't know what is. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because that's the whole point of this channel. Is the murder interpretation 100% certain? No. It's a reconstruction built from a skull, and there are always people who read the evidence differently. Maybe an accident with a very specific geometry, maybe something we haven't thought of. That's how this science works, and it's healthy. But the forensic case that Cranium-17 was killed by another individual is strong, carefully argued, and widely taken seriously. It is, at the very least, the best candidate we have for the oldest murder, and the reasoning behind it is a beautiful example of how much you can wring out of a single damaged bone if you ask the right questions. Let's zoom out, because this discovery does something important. It punctures a comforting myth, the idea that violence between people is a modern corruption, that our deep ancestors lived in some peaceful Eden, and that cruelty was invented alongside cities and property and greed. The pit of bones says otherwise. The capacity to kill one another deliberately and face to face is not a recent invention. It goes back further than our own species. It's older than Homo sapiens. It may be part of the deep inheritance of being human or human adjacent at all. But, and this is the part I really want you to hold on to, the pit of bones tells us something else at the exact same time, and it points in the opposite direction. Because those 28 bodies carried into the dark and placed together suggest that the capacity for reverence is just as old as the capacity for violence. The same population that produced a killer also apparently produced people who couldn't bear to simply leave their dead where they fell. They carried them. They chose a place for them. Grief or ritual or something we don't have a word for, drove them down into that cave, killing and caring side by side nearly 500,000 years ago. And honestly, isn't that the whole human story in miniature? We are the species that builds hospitals and weapons, that writes love poems and declares wars, that will risk our lives to save a stranger, and also sometimes look another person in the face and do the unthinkable. We tend to think of this contradiction as something civilization created, as if we were simple and innocent once, and got complicated later. The pit of bones suggests the contradiction was there from the very beginning. We didn't invent our darkness or our tenderness. We inherited both from people who lived and killed and mourned in a Spanish cave 430,000 years before we were born. And Cranium-17 doesn't stand entirely alone, which is part of why it's so persuasive. Scattered across the human fossil record are other, younger hints of violence between individuals, healed and unhealed injuries that are hard to explain as accidents. There's a famous Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave with a wound that some researchers have linked to a thrown or projectile impact. There are later skeletons showing blows to the head, embedded points, defensive fractures on the forearms, the kind of injury you get when you raise your arm to shield your face. Taken together, these cases sketch an uncomfortable truth. For as long as there have been people, some people have hurt other people on purpose. Cranium-17 just happens to be, so far, the oldest and one of the clearest examples we've managed to document. It's the earliest chapter of a very long, very human book that, tragically, we're all still writing. There's one more thing that gets me about this site. Those bones are so old and so well preserved that researchers have even managed to pull ancient DNA from some of them, pushing genetic evidence back far deeper in time than anyone once thought possible, and helping us map exactly where these people sat on the road to the Neanderthals. So the pit of bones isn't just a crime scene and a tomb, it's a library. Quick note before we start. It's one of the richest single windows we have into a chapter of the human family that would otherwise be almost completely dark. And we only have it because, hundreds of thousands of years ago, for reasons we'll never fully know, people kept bringing their dead to the top of that shaft. So the next time you hear someone claim that human violence is purely a product of modern life, you can tell them about Cranium-17, the skull with 2 matching holes struck down face to face, and then carried with strange tenderness into the pit of bones. Our capacity to harm each other is ancient, but so, thankfully, is our refusal to just walk away from our dead. All the sources are in the description. The forensic study of Cranium-17, the work on the Sima de los Huesos population, the ancient DNA results. Go read them. The detective work alone is worth your time. And remember, the person in that pit, killer and victim alike, is your distant family. So stay curious about the whole of what we are, the light and the dark, and keep digging. See you in the next one. Bye.